All right, me. It is late November. It's like mid-November, but it is late on a Wednesday night. And much earlier today, I finished reading Paradise Lost, written by John Milton. I'm recording this so much later because the way that this book is structured is that this book is in itself is actually almost 700 pages. The first 300 of which are the actual poem written by John Milton, and then the last 400 are short essays, biographies, discussions on the religious doctrine that is discussed in Paradise Lost. And I read about another 100 I wrote about 100 pages of that. And I decided that, you know what, it is, for my purposes, not the best choice to read all of those and then do this. And certainly part of that is just wariness of reading that many different essays and different discussions. And, you know, that is certainly a willpower type issue. But I think also part of it is that, like, I would say a huge point of this and this whole project is for it to be a discussion, whether it be with myself, past, current, and present, whether it is a discussion with, you know, whoever decides that they want to interact with this personal project that I'm doing, right? And so to read all of these almost 400 pages of things that are about this book and about this poem, and then provide my thoughts and my feelings about it, I think takes away from that. So yeah. The poem itself is certainly, I mean, obviously the hardest barrier to it is how it is structured, right? It is written in the 1600s by John Milton. John Milton loves to write in these immensely long sentences. I mean, some of these sentences can go on for an entire page, which is fine, right? But because it is constantly doing that, it just gets so tiresome to read. There's also the whole issue of where it is not fully grammatically put together in the way that we would want to associate with modern linguistics and modern English, partially because it is meant to be an epic poem that is effectively read aloud, right? And so it is structured, and the punctuation is structured in a way of kind of indicating how it is supposed to be read and spoken, which also made it just like this kind of monster in a lot of ways. But yeah. It's structured in a way that is kind of interesting because effectively it is this kind of retelling of the book of Genesis by taking in not only what is within the book of Genesis, but also what is described through other different books of the Old and New Testament, and kind of putting them all together and then making a cohesive poem and like epic poem and narrative around it, right? There is a note, I think, in the introduction that Milton was, shortly after this was published, Milton was approached to make it into a play very shortly afterwards, because it is very much written like a play. And I think that that thinking of this is a 1600s spoken word play really did help me a whole lot, because instead of viewing this as like a poem or a book or a story that is dialogue focused and about interactions between characters, right? This is a lot of monologues from every single character and person that will eventually become kind of cohesive, but it is a lot of monologuing and soliloquy, based on the fact that it is effectively a stage play that is written as an epic poem. And so much of like contextualization has to be spoken aloud and you know, said by the character, which it's so in that way it's kind of structured a little weird. There's a good amount of like understanding of just background knowledge in at least within the book of Genesis, that needs to be kind of understood, or at least vaguely known about, in order to kind of get what this book is and what this poem is putting out there. I don't think it's really necessary, right? I was someone who was raised in a very Christian-based society, right? But I myself was never very religious. So like, I'm aware, and I've heard talk, and I've, you know, I have an idea, but it was never something that was very well drilled into me, or something that I interacted with a lot, right? And so, you know, and I understood it fairly well. So yeah. It's this version, which is technically the second version, is broken up into 12 books, cantos, if you know, that's the better way to describe it. And the first publication by John Milton, I think, was in 10, and I think it's because he combined like books 9, 10, and 11 into one large book, which would have just been a monstrosity to read. Partially because like so much of what is kind of covered by the book is like the first 6 cantos, basically the first half of this is, why does God create Eden? How does Lucifer, Satan, find a way into Eden? And then why is Adam there? And then it's like book 7 is the creation of Eve. Book 8 is like kind of like what is book 8? I don't even know what book 8 is, but I think it's like book 9 is the actual original sin, right? It is Eve eating the apple by temptation from the snake, and then Adam also then choosing to stay with Eve instead of staying in Eden. Book 10 is kind of the revelation and what is God going to do about this? And then books 11 and 12 is kind of like the outfall and the wrapping up of everything, right? And so it's like there's so much background and so much information that gets kind of poured into you, and then halfway through is when all the action occurs, right? So it's also a little bit of a slog because of that. But yeah. Certainly, right within Christian doctrine, there is a lot of discussion, a lot of interpretation about how to view these things, right? And what my personal argument is, with no basis other than what I understand and this piece of literature and, my growing up in this world, is that my argument is really that the original sin should not be considered to be Eve eating the apple. I really don't think that is the original sin as described. I genuinely believe that the original sin is the pride that is shown within God. And the reason I say this is because when we are looking at the two creations by God, in both Lucifer, who is the greatest of all angels, before he decides that he should receive benefits or power, but instead God's son does. And as is described, right, man is created within God, in God's image. And then Adam does something in this book specifically that to me is a very prideful move. And then Eve does something that is incredibly prideful that then leads to her downfall eventually, which causes all this to happen, right? And what to me is shown is that the creatures that God has created within his image, the first thing that they do that is predicates their downfall is this pride, right? Whether it's Lucifer and feel that he should be in charge of things because he is the best of all angels, or within Paradise Lost, Adam making the decision that he needs to have another human, and then Eve being prideful in herself that she should be allowed to be by herself and do work by herself and not be with Adam, right? All of these things are decisions of pride and actions of pride that then predicate this downfall. And so, as described in my opinion of reading this, that really the first sin is that God is prideful, and every creature that he creates within his own image is also going to have that inherent pride, but does not have the power or the ability to necessarily act on it, right? So that's that. There's also a lot to say about gender within this, as there is with any discussion of the Bible in a lot of ways. And part of this was me losing track of characters just because there's the way it's structured is also that sometimes you just lose track of characters if you're not reading this with heavy discussion with someone who's studied this a great deal. And so it is my understanding is that there comes a point in which, right, God does not necessarily directly communicate with Adam. He instead communicates through his angels, who then communicate to Adam. But then also the angels don't talk to Eve until Eve has committed the sin of eating the apple, right? Instead, she then has to hear all this information from Adam. And so it becomes this whole issue of like, if she was just allowed to be treated as a person from the very beginning, instead of the whole concept of that she is lesser than man because she is created from man, then I would argue that this never would have happened, right? because part of her argument that she makes when she makes her wants to be by herself and work by herself, to garden Eden, is that she feels that she needs to like prove that she is worth something, right? It is that prideful aspect of it, but then also just because, right, as has been shown, both God and the angels don't communicate with her everything that she learns about Lucifer and the garden and all this is learned through Adam. So yeah. I don't know. I feel like there's so much to say, and I just don't have the words for it. Partially because, you know, there is so much Christian doctrine in here that I don't feel I'm necessarily qualified to directly talk about. Certainly, I've already talked about things that I'm not qualified to talk about, or there's probably much further understanding and description and readings that I should that contradict what I've said, right? But yeah. We also get into this kind of weird thing in which we kind of cut back to God's discussion with the angels and with his son a couple different times, and it was a very interesting thing of where, like, God at one point, I think it's in book 9 or book 10, in which, like, he says, like, none of this could have been stopped, and I will not stop it, right? And, you know, I think it always brings up the paradoxical question of, like, the paradox question of, like, if can God create something so strong that not even he can stop it, right? And I think it very much puts in this whole thing, and I think becomes in a lot of ways this misunderstanding within Christianity of where, like, it is God as described within the Christian doctrine is this leader and this ruler, but we are like an experiment to him, and it is his son Josiah, Jesus, that acts within direct communication with humanity, which I think is the thing that sometimes gets overlooked or seen, not talked about a whole bunch. But yeah. There's also this fun part done by John Milton in which he is describing the battle of heaven that leads to the creation of hell, which is not Lucifer gets sent there to be the leader. It is they all get sent there to suffer, which is much more in line with Dante's version and Inferno, where everyone is meant to suffer, than a lot of modern depictions, which posit Satan much more as like a Pluto or a Hades, as like a ruler of the underworld. It is a place of suffering. It's not a place of rulership. And but he like describes this through one of the angels, describes the battle of heaven and the stopping of Lucifer, and about all of these angels that have died, and he like lists a couple of angels and actions, and then at one point he just goes, yeah, there's a whole bunch of other ones, but I'm just not going to list them. Of course, he certainly does it a lot more eloquently, but that was a very fun moment with that. But yeah, I think that's kind of all I have to say on this currently. I'm also, part of it is I'm tired, part of it is, you know, I read this over a couple different sittings. Certainly not a lot of it stuck with me as much as it should have. But yeah, that is Paradise Lost by John Milton.